The kingdom of Drakenhold stood as a beacon of strength and resilience, its towering castle rising high above the rolling hills and vast forests that bordered its lands. Drakenhold Castle was not just a symbol of power. It was a fortress, a citadel that had withstood countless sieges and battles. Its stone walls, thick and unyielding, bore the scars of wars long past, while its towers pierced the sky, crowned with banners fluttering in the cold wind. The castle's strategic position, nestled between the treacherous mountain passes to the north and the fertile plains to the south, made it the heart of the kingdom's defense. From the battlements, one could see the sprawling landscape below, where the kingdom's army was mobilized, their armor gleaming in the faint morning light. Blacksmiths worked tirelessly in the forges, the rhythmic clang of hammers against steel echoing through the courtyard. The scent of smoke and iron filled the air, mingling with the anticipation of battle. Far off, the distant call of war trumpets sent a shiver through the ranks, signaling that an enemy approached. Inside the castle, however, a different battle was brewing. King Edric, once a mighty ruler, now lay bedridden, his body frail and his mind clouded by illness. His absence from the throne had left a power vacuum, and the court was rife with intrigue. Noble houses, once united under a common cause, now jostled for influence, each seeking to place their own candidate on the throne. The king's advisors whispered behind closed doors, their loyalties divided, while rumors of betrayal and conspiracy spread like wildfire. Drakenhold, despite its mighty walls, was crumbling from within. The tension was palpable, a kingdom on the brink of civil unrest, even as an external threat loomed large. In every corridor, eyes watched and ears listened, for in this climate of uncertainty, even allies could not be trusted. At the center of this storm was Sir Alistair, a knight of great renown. Tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes that had seen the horrors of war, Alistair was a man marked by both physical and emotional scars. His armor, though polished, bore the dents and scratches of countless battles, each one a testament to his service to the crown. His face, weathered and lined, spoke of the weight he carried, not just as a warrior, but as a man who had made choices that haunted him. Years of combat had forged him into a seasoned leader, a knight who could rally his men and strike fear into the hearts of his enemies. But beneath his stoic exterior, a moral dilemma gnawed at him, one that had plagued him for years. Alistair had sworn an oath to protect the kingdom, to serve King Edric with unwavering loyalty. Yet as the kingdom faltered, he found himself questioning the very nature of that loyalty. The nobles who vied for power were more concerned with their own ambitions than the welfare of the people. Alistair had fought for Drakenhold with the belief that he was defending a just and noble cause. But now, with the king incapacitated and the court corrupt, he wasn't so sure. He stood at a crossroads. Should he continue to serve a kingdom that seemed to be rotting from within, or should he stand with the common folk, the farmers and villagers who would pay the ultimate price for the nobles' power struggles? This internal conflict weighed heavily on him, far more than any sword or shield. Every time he looked out over the castle's walls, he saw not just the enemy gathering beyond the horizon, but the people of Drakenhold, innocent lives caught in the crossfire of a war they had no part in. Sir Alistair's sense of duty was unwavering, but his sense of justice was louder. He had seen too many good men die for the pride of lords and kings, and with Drakenhold on the verge of both external invasion and internal collapse, he knew that difficult decisions lay ahead. As he prepared for the battles to come, both within and beyond the castle walls, Sir Alistair felt the weight of his past choices pressed down on him. His loyalty to the throne was no longer just a question of honor. It had become a question of morality. Could he, in good conscience, lead men into battle for a kingdom that might not deserve their sacrifice? And if he chose to defy the court, to stand for the people rather than the crown, what kind of knight would he become? The answers were as elusive as the enemy that now threatened Drakenhold. But one thing was clear. The days ahead would test not only his skill as a warrior but also his very soul. The peace of the early morning was shattered by the sound of hurried footsteps echoing through the stone corridors of Drakenhold Castle. The atmosphere, already tense with the weight of political uncertainty, grew even heavier as the castle gates creaked open to admit a rider, his horse foaming at the mouth from the long and grueling journey. The rider's face was pale, his armor dusted with the dirt of the road, and the urgency in his eyes was unmistakable. He had ridden through the night, desperate to deliver a message that could change the fate of the kingdom. As he approached the great hall, where the king's council gathered in the absence of their ailing monarch, the clatter of his boots against the cold stone floors drew the attention of every guard and courtier. With barely a moment to catch his breath, the rider's voice rang out, shaking the hearts of those present. "Lord Mortar is marching on Drakenhold." A ripple of shock coursed through the hall. followed swiftly by murmurs of fear and disbelief. Lord Mortar. The very name carried a weight of terror and destruction. He was a ruthless warlord from the northern lands, a man known not just for his military genius, but for the sheer brutality of his campaigns. His army was feared across the continent. Hardened, merciless soldiers who left nothing but devastation in their wake. Villages burned, fields salted, and the bodies of the fallen displayed as grim reminders of his conquests. Lord Mortar had risen to power through blood and iron, and now he had set his sights on Drakenhold, a kingdom already teetering on the edge of collapse. Sir Alistair, standing at the far end of the hall, felt the weight of the rider's words like a physical blow. There was no time to waste. His duty, as always, was clear: defend the kingdom at all costs. But the reality of the situation gnawed at him. Drakenhold, in its current state, was unprepared for such an attack. The army was stretched thin, morale was low, and the political factions vying for control had left the kingdom weakened and disorganized. The forces of Lord Mortar were likely twice the size of their own, and Alistair knew that the warlord would not hesitate to lay siege to the castle, killing anyone who stood in his way. With a calm born from years of battle, Sir Alistair stepped forward, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "We have no choice but to fight," he declared, though deep down, the weight of that decision pressed heavily upon him. As the highest-ranking knight and the kingdom's most trusted military leader, it was his responsibility to lead the defense. But as he looked into the eyes of his fellow knights and the courtiers who clung to their illusions of safety, he wondered how many of them would survive the coming storm. Drakenhold had faced enemies before, but never one as ruthless, as relentless, as Lord Mortar. The council, still reeling from the news, looked to Sir Alistair for guidance. He could see the fear in their faces, the uncertainty that had plagued them for weeks now compounded by the threat of imminent destruction. There would be no reinforcements from neighboring kingdoms. Drakenhold was isolated, its allies reluctant to involve themselves in its internal strife. This battle would be fought alone, and the outcome would determine the kingdom's future. "Prepare the men," Alistair commanded, his voice steady though his mind raced with the magnitude of what lay ahead. "We fortify the walls, double the guard at the gates, and call every able-bodied man to arms. If Lord Mortar comes for Drakenhold, we will be ready." Even as he gave the orders, doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve. The kingdom was fractured, its leadership weak, and the army had not seen a battle of this scale in years. Could they truly stand against the might of Lord Mortar's forces? And at what cost? Alistair knew that the defense of Drakenhold would not just be a test of military might, but a test of his own conscience. The lives of thousands depended on his leadership, and yet, deep within, he questioned whether the kingdom was worth the blood that would be spilled. The nobles who now quarreled over the throne had done little to earn his loyalty, and the king, though once great, was a shadow of his former self. Was Alistair truly fighting for a cause he believed in, or was he simply upholding an oath that had long since lost its meaning? As the soldiers of Drakenhold began their preparations, Sir Alistair walked the battlements, his eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, the dark line of Lord Mortar's army was already visible, a growing mass of banners and steel, moving ever closer to the castle's walls. The sound of drums carried on the wind, a grim reminder of the bloodshed that was soon to follow. Alistair's heart pounded in his chest as the reality of the situation set in. War was upon them, and with it, the fate of the kingdom would be decided. But even as he prepared for battle, another question lingered in his mind, one that he could not yet answer. Was this the fight he was meant to lead? Or was his true battle yet to come? One that would force him to choose not between life and death, but between loyalty and justice? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the castle, Sir Alistair stood alone atop the walls, his mind racing with the decisions that would soon shape the future of Drakenhold. The drums of war grew louder, and with them, the weight of his choices pressed ever heavier on his soul. As the shadows lengthened and the sun dipped below the horizon, the castle of Drakenhold buzzed with an urgency that had not been felt in years. The courtyard, usually a place of muted activity, now roared with the sound of preparation. Blacksmiths hammered late into the night, their forges glowing like embers in the gathering darkness, crafting swords, shields, and armor for men who had never before seen battle. The clanking of metal on metal echoed off the stone walls, while the hurried footsteps of messengers and soldiers alike created a frantic rhythm. Horses neighed nervously in their stables, sensing the tension that hung thick in the air, and the distant murmur of prayers could be heard as the castle's chaplain moved among the men, offering blessings to those who sought comfort in faith. At the center of it all stood Sir Alistair, a solitary figure in the midst of the chaos, his presence both commanding and somber. His eyes, hardened by years of combat, swept over the scene before him. He watched as young recruits, barely more than boys, struggled to lift swords that seemed too heavy for their untested arms. Many of these men had never fought in a real battle, their hands more accustomed to plows and hammers than to weapons of war. The reality of their inexperience gnawed at Alistair's conscience. Drakenhold's once mighty army had been depleted by years of political infighting and neglect. Now, with an enemy as formidable as Lord Mortar at their gates, they were woefully unprepared. As he moved through the ranks, Alistair could hear the hushed whispers of the soldiers. Some spoke of valor and glory, eager to prove themselves in the fight to come, while others, more seasoned, muttered words of doubt and fear. They knew the odds were against them. Lord Mortar's reputation preceded him. He was a ruthless commander, and his army was vast, disciplined, and merciless. Drakenhold, by contrast, was fractured and weak, its soldiers a patchwork of farmers, tradesmen, and veterans too old to be on the front lines. Alistair clenched his jaw as he listened, feeling the weight of responsibility settle like an iron mantle on his shoulders. In his heart, Alistair knew the truth. The kingdom was not ready for this war. The political infighting that had plagued Drakenhold for years had left the kingdom vulnerable, its resources squandered and its people divided. The king's illness had created a vacuum of leadership, and the nobles who now jockeyed for power had done little to strengthen the realm. And yet, here they were, on the eve of battle, preparing to defend a kingdom that was, in many ways, already crumbling from within. As he watched the soldiers don their armor and test their weapons, Alistair could not shake the feeling that this was a battle they were doomed to lose. And yet they had no choice. Lord Mortar would not show mercy. Surrender was not an option. If they failed to defend Drakenhold, the kingdom would fall, and with it, the lives of thousands of innocent people. It was this knowledge that drove Alistair forward, that kept him issuing orders and rallying the troops, despite the gnawing doubt that plagued him. But as the preparations continued, another question loomed large in his mind, one that had no easy answer. Was it worth it? Was it worth sacrificing the lives of so many young men for a kingdom that was already on the brink of collapse? Was this the battle that would restore Drakenhold to its former glory, or was it simply the last desperate gasp of a dying realm? Alistair's thoughts grew heavier as he passed by a group of fresh recruits, their faces pale with fear and uncertainty. He paused for a moment, watching them struggle to fasten their breastplates and adjust their helmets. Their hands trembled, not with the cold, but with the realization of what lay ahead. These were not seasoned warriors. They were boys, barely old enough to understand the full gravity of war. They looked up at him with wide, anxious eyes, as if seeking reassurance, as if his very presence could somehow protect them from the horrors they were about to face. Alistair's heart clenched. He had led men into battle before. He had seen them fall beside him, heard their last breaths as the life drained from their bodies. But these young recruits were different. They were not ready, and deep down, Alistair knew it. For a moment, he stood in silence, his eyes scanning the sea of faces before him. He could see the determination in some, the fear in others, and the heartbreaking innocence in many. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, heavier than any armor he had ever worn. Each one of these men was a life, a son, a brother, a father, and Alistair knew that many of them would not live to see another sunrise. He had fought in wars before, but this felt different. This was not just a battle for territory or power. This was a battle for survival. And yet, the very kingdom they were fighting to protect was rotting from within. As he turned away from the recruits, Alistair's mind churned with conflicting thoughts. He was a knight, sworn to defend Drakenhold, to uphold the honor of the kingdom and protect its people. But the kingdom he had sworn to protect was not the same as it once was. The political corruption, the greed of the nobles, the endless power struggles, these were not the values he had fought for. And yet, duty demanded that he lead these men into battle, that he fight for a kingdom that might not be worth the cost. With a heavy sigh, Alistair walked toward the battlements, where the watchmen kept vigil over the approaching enemy. He could see the distant glow of campfires on the horizon, where Lord Mortar's forces were gathering, preparing to lay siege to Drakenhold. The drums of war had begun to beat, their rhythmic pounding a grim reminder of the bloodshed that awaited. Alistair's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword, his mind racing with the decisions he would soon have to make. He was a knight, a warrior, but more than that, he was a man caught between duty and conscience, between loyalty to the crown and the lives of the men under his command. As the night deepened and the final preparations were made, Sir Alistair stood alone atop the walls, gazing out over the kingdom he had sworn to protect. The wind howled through the battlements, carrying with it the scent of impending death. War was coming, and with it, the answers to the questions that haunted him. But for now, all he could do was prepare, and hope that when the time came, he would make the right choice, for his men, for the kingdom, and for himself. As the preparations for war continued, the tension inside the walls of Drakenhold grew as thick as the gathering clouds overhead. Sir Alistair, burdened with the responsibility of leading a kingdom that teetered on the brink of collapse, found himself pulled in conflicting directions. The weight of the coming battle pressed down on him, but even heavier was the moral question of whether this fight was truly just. In the days leading up to the inevitable clash, two voices rose louder than the others, each one tugging at his conscience, and each one representing a different path for the kingdom's future. The first was Lady Elora, a woman of quiet strength and deep wisdom. She had served the royal family as a healer for many years, but her counsel extended far beyond the physical ailments of the body. Her connection to the people of Drakenhold and her insight into the human condition made her a trusted advisor, though her views were often seen as too idealistic for the hardened knights and courtiers. Alistair had come to value her advice over the years, especially in matters of morality, and now, as the kingdom faced its greatest threat, he found himself seeking her out. They met in the castle's garden, a quiet refuge amidst the chaos, where the scent of herbs and flowers mingled with the cool evening air. Lady Elora stood near a stone bench, her hands gently tending to the plants she had nurtured for years. Alistair approached, his armor clinking softly, though his mind was far from calm. He didn't need to speak. Elora could see the conflict written across his face. "You are troubled, Alistair," she said softly, her eyes not leaving the delicate herb in her hand. "The weight of command bears heavily on you." He sighed, running a gauntlet hand through his hair. "I am Elora. The battle ahead. It feels wrong. We are not prepared, and yet, I must lead these men into a fight they may not survive. I can't shake the feeling that this is all in vain." Elora turned to face him, her gaze filled with a quiet intensity. "Does it have to be this way? Must there be bloodshed?" Alistair looked at her, surprised by the question. "Lord Mortar does not negotiate. He is a butcher. You know as well as I that he won't stop until Drakenhold falls." "But you are not Lord Mortar," she countered, her voice calm but firm. "You have a choice. You can seek another way. Diplomacy, a truce, perhaps even surrender. If it saves lives, is that not worth more than holding on to this castle?" Alistair's brow furrowed. "Surrender? How can I even consider that? Drakenhold is our home, and I swore an oath to protect it." Elora took a step closer, her voice lowering, though its power was unmistakable. "And what is Drakenhold without its people? Stones can be rebuilt, walls can be raised again, but once a life is lost, it cannot be replaced. You speak of honor, but what honor is there in sending young men to die for a kingdom already dying from within? You know this. You've seen it. The corruption, the greed, those are the real enemies, not Lord Mortar." Her words struck deep. Alistair had indeed seen the rot spreading through the kingdom's core. The noble squabbles for power, the neglect of the common people, and the king's slow descent into illness had all left Drakenhold a shadow of what it once was. Could he truly sacrifice so many lives for a kingdom that no longer represented the values he had fought for? Lady Elora's plea for peace stirred something in him, but he wasn't ready to let go of his duty. Before he could respond, the door to the garden swung open with force, and Sir Roland, Alistair's oldest friend and most trusted companion, strode in. His face was flushed with the heat of the forge, where he had been overseeing the final preparations for the battle. Roland was a man of action, a warrior who believed that strength and resolve were the only paths to victory. "Elora, always with your soft words," Roland said, shaking his head. "You would have us kneel before Lord Mortar and beg for mercy while he burns our homes and slaughters our people." Alistair turned to him, his heart conflicted. "Roland, she speaks reason. We are not prepared for this fight. The men, half of them are not even soldiers. They're farmers and smiths. And what would you have us do, Alistair? Run. Hide." Roland's voice was sharp, but it carried a deep loyalty. "If we surrender, we may as well slit our own throats. Lord Mortar doesn't care for mercy, and neither do his men. They will ravage this land, and our people will suffer all the more. The only way to stop him is to fight. Lady Alora shook her head, her voice steady in the face of Roland's fire. "And how many will die in that fight, Roland? How many sons, fathers, and brothers will be lost before you realize that this is a battle we cannot win?" Roland glared at her, his hands clenched into fists. "Better to die with a sword in hand than live under the boot of a tyrant. I will not see Drakenhold fall without a fight." "Alistair, you know this is true." Alistair looked between the two, torn. Elora's plea for peace tugged at his heart. He did not want to lead these men to their deaths. But Roland's call to arms resonated with his sense of duty and honor. The kingdom was crumbling. But could he simply walk away from the oaths he had sworn? The tension between them was palpable, and in that moment, Alistair realized that no matter which path he chose, lives would be lost. "Elora is right," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. "This kingdom is falling apart from the inside. But Roland is also right. Lord Mortar will show no mercy. I cannot surrender. But perhaps there is another way." Elora and Roland both stared at him, waiting for him to continue. "There are those in the far reaches of the kingdom who still remember the old alliances," Alistair said, his mind racing. "The Guardians of the Forest. They are a powerful people, and they owe us a debt. If I can reach them, perhaps they will fight alongside us. It's a slim hope, but it's the only one we have left." Elora's face softened, a glimmer of hope lighting her eyes. "If anyone can convince them, it's you, Alistair. But the journey will be dangerous." Roland, though still skeptical, nodded grudgingly. "Better to try than to sit and wait for Mortar's blade. But you must return quickly. The men need you." Alistair looked at them both, his heart still heavy with the choices before him, but his resolve hardening. The path was uncertain, the outcome unknown, but for the first time in days, he felt a sense of purpose. He would seek the Guardians. He would not surrender Drakenhold without a fight, but he would not throw away the lives of his men without exhausting every possibility. Time was running out, but hope, though fragile, remained. The sun barely peeked over the horizon as the first wave of Lord Mortar's army surged toward the walls of Drakenhold. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and sweat, mingling with the metallic tang of sharpened steel. Sir Alistair stood atop the battlements, his eyes narrowed as he watched the enemy's ranks march in perfect unison, their shields raised like an impenetrable wall. Mortar's banners, black and red, fluttered ominously in the wind, signaling death and destruction. The distant thud of war drums echoed through the valley, a slow and steady rhythm that sent a chill through the men gathered behind Drakenhold's fortified walls. The tension was palpable, a coiled spring ready to snap. Alistair turned to his men, rows of soldiers clad in armor, their faces pale with fear but determined. Many of them were young, their hands gripping swords and shields for the first time in their lives. But here, on this day, they would be baptized in the flames of battle. Alistair's voice boomed as he addressed them, his words carried by the wind. "Hold the line. Show no fear. Today, we fight not just for Drakenhold, but for our lives, our homes, our families." His words, though meant to inspire, did little to ease the dread creeping into their hearts. As the enemy army approached, the gates of Drakenhold creaked open, and the knights charged out to meet them. The clash was immediate and brutal. The battlefield exploded into chaos as the two armies collided. The sound was deafening, the metallic ring of swords clashing, the dull thud of shields slamming into each other, and the visceral cries of men locked in combat. The ground beneath their feet churned with mud and blood as bodies fell and horses screamed. The sun, now fully risen, cast long shadows over the carnage, as if the very world itself recoiled at the violence unfolding. Sir Alistair was a whirlwind of steel, his sword flashing in the morning light as he cut through the enemy ranks. He moved with precision and lethal grace, years of experience honed in the fires of countless battles. His every strike was calculated, each swing of his sword bringing down another foe. But as skilled as he was, even he could not stem the tide alone. The forces of Lord Mortar were relentless, pushing forward with a cold, mechanical efficiency. For every enemy that Alistair struck down, two more took their place, their faces hidden behind grim, featureless helmets. All around him, the men of Drakenhold fought valiantly, but it quickly became clear that they were outmatched. The inexperience of the recruits showed as they faltered under the unyielding pressure of Mortar's seasoned warriors. The Knights of Drakenhold held their ground for as long as they could, but the cracks in their defense began to show. Shields splintered, swords were knocked from trembling hands, and men were cut down where they stood. Alistair could see the fear in their eyes, the realization that they were fighting a losing battle. Above the din of war, Alistair's commanding voice rang out, directing his men to regroup, to form defensive lines, but the chaos was too great. The battlefield had become a nightmare of blood and steel, a swirling vortex of death where orders were drowned out by the screams of the dying. Mortar's forces, well-trained and ruthless, exploited every weakness in Drakenhold's defenses, their relentless assault threatening to overwhelm the kingdom's last line of defense. Alistair parried a blow from a massive enemy knight, the force of the strike rattling his bones, but he held firm, driving his sword into his foe's chest with a grunt of exertion. Yet even as he fought with all his strength, a cold truth began to settle in his mind. This battle could not be won through sheer force alone. No matter how fiercely he fought, no matter how many enemies he cut down, Mortar's army was simply too vast, too disciplined. Drakenhold's soldiers, brave as they were, lacked the experience and the numbers to withstand the onslaught. For every man who fell, another of Mortar's soldiers took his place, and the tide of battle began to turn inexorably in the enemy's favor. Alistair's heart pounded as he surveyed the battlefield, his keen eyes picking out the signs of collapse. His men were faltering, the defensive lines breaking under the pressure. He saw Sir Roland, his closest friend, locked in brutal combat, felling enemies left and right, but even Roland's strength could not hold back the flood. The walls of Drakenhold, once thought to be impregnable, were now vulnerable as enemy forces began to breach the gates. Alistair knew that if they lost control of the gates, the battle would be over. Desperation clawed at him as he fought his way through the throngs of men, shouting orders, rallying his troops, but it was clear that Drakenhold's defenses were crumbling. The battlefield was strewn with the bodies of the dead and dying, the air thick with the stench of blood and smoke. His sword arm ached, his breath came in ragged gasps, but still, he fought on. And yet, even as his sword sang through the air, cleaving through armor and bone, the realization gnawed at him. Brute strength would not be enough. Drakenhold could not win this war through force alone. The kingdom's enemies were too many, too well prepared, and the kingdom itself was too divided, too weakened by the political infighting that had left them vulnerable. Alistair had always believed that victory could be achieved through valor and skill, but now he saw the folly in that belief. War was not just a test of strength, it was a game of strategy, of cunning, and they were losing. As the battle raged on, Alistair made a decision. This would not be the hill on which Drakenhold fell. He would not allow his men to die needlessly, not for a lost cause. The time had come to retreat, to regroup, and to find another way. His thoughts turned to the guardians of the forest, the ancient allies who had long been forgotten by the kingdom. They were Drakenhold's last hope, a wild card in this brutal game of survival. With a final swing of his sword, Alistair cut down the enemy in front of him and turned to his men. "Fall back," he bellowed, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "To the gates! Fall back!" His orders were met with confusion at first, but as the soldiers saw the gates of Drakenhold beginning to give way, they obeyed, retreating in ragged lines back toward the safety of the castle walls. As they fled, Alistair's heart sank. He had led his men into a battle they could not win, and now they were paying the price. But even as they retreated, he knew that this was not the end. Drakenhold would not fall today. Not if he had anything to say about it. The aftermath of the battle was a scene of devastation. Drakenhold's fields, once green and fertile, were now soaked with blood. Bodies of soldiers, both friend and foe, littered the ground, their armor twisted and broken, their weapons abandoned. Smoke curled up from the fires that had been sparked during the fray, and the acrid stench of burning wood and flesh filled the air. The once proud banners of Drakenhold lay trampled in the mud, torn and stained, a grim symbol of their defeat. Sir Alistair stood amidst the wreckage, his sword hanging loosely by his side, the weight of the loss pressing down on him like never before. They had fought bravely, but it hadn't been enough. The sheer might of Lord Mortar's army had crushed their defenses, and the men of Drakenhold, despite their courage, had fallen in droves. Alistair had led them, given them everything he had, but the outcome had been inevitable from the moment the first blow was struck. Now, the kingdom he had sworn to protect lay in ruin, and the survivors, those lucky enough to escape with their lives, huddled behind the castle walls, too few to mount any further defense. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the battlefield as Alistair surveyed the remnants of his forces. The gates of Drakenhold were battered and barely holding. Inside, the people were gripped by fear, knowing that it was only a matter of time before Lord Mortar's forces returned to deliver the final blow. The castle's stone walls, once thought impregnable, now seemed fragile, vulnerable, and every passing hour brought them closer to inevitable destruction. It was in this moment of crushing defeat that Alistair was confronted with a choice, one that would define the future of Drakenhold and his legacy as a knight. Surrender or seek salvation. As he stood amidst the broken bodies of his fallen comrades, he felt the weight of this dilemma gnawing at him. The once clear path of duty was now shrouded in uncertainty. Surrendering to Lord Mortar was the most straightforward option. He could save the lives of those who remained, the innocent people of Drakenhold who had no part in the political squabbles that had led to this moment. If he bent the knee, perhaps Mortar would show mercy, granting them some semblance of peace. But Alistair knew Mortar's reputation all too well. The warlord was known not just for his military brilliance, but for his cruelty. Surrendering would mean handing over the kingdom, allowing Mortar to crush it under his iron heel. Drakenhold would fall, not in flames, but in chains. Was that truly a fate worth sparing? The thought of it turned his stomach. He had fought too long and too hard to see the kingdom handed over to a tyrant, and yet, the alternative seemed equally impossible. His mind drifted to the Guardians of the Forest, the last glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak future. The Guardians were an ancient mysterious tribe that dwelled deep within the dark, untamed forests on the outskirts of Drakenhold. Legends spoke of their power. Rumors of magic and ancient wisdom passed down through the generations. They had once been allies of the kingdom, but that alliance had been broken long ago, marred by betrayal and distrust. Reaching out to the Guardians would be a desperate gamble, and Alistair knew that if they refused, Drakenhold would be left defenseless. There was no guarantee that they would even listen, let alone come to their aid. The history between the kingdom and the Guardians was fraught with tension, and many of Drakenhold's current leaders had scorned the old ways, dismissing the tribe's power as mere superstition. But Alistair had seen enough of the world to know that there was truth in the old legends. He had witnessed things in battle, moments that defied explanation, and he believed, deep down, that the Guardians could tip the scales in their favor. But to pursue this path would mean leaving Drakenhold at its most vulnerable. He would have to travel alone, deep into the forest, without knowing if he could even return in time to prevent the kingdom's fall. It was a risk that terrified him, and yet, it was a risk he knew he had to take. Strength alone had not been enough to stop Mortar's forces. They needed something more, something ancient, something beyond the realm of swords and shields. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the battlefield, Sir Alistair made his decision. He could not surrender Drakenhold. Too many had died to protect it, and though the kingdom was weakened, it was not yet broken. There was still hope, however fragile. His course was clear. He would venture into the heart of the forest, seeking an alliance with the Guardians, no matter the cost. Alistair sheathed his sword and turned away from the field of death. The road ahead was fraught with danger, both from the forest itself and from Lord Mortar, who no doubt had spies watching the kingdom's every move. But Alistair's resolve was unshakable. He would do whatever it took to save Drakenhold, even if it meant embracing powers he did not fully understand. Before he departed, he called a meeting of the remaining leaders within the castle walls. Lady Elora was there, her face pale but resolute. Sir Roland stood beside her, battered but unbroken, his loyalty to Alistair unwavering. They listened in silence as Alistair explained his plan, their faces reflecting the gravity of the situation. "Elora, you must hold the castle in my absence," Alistair said, his voice low but firm. "Do whatever it takes to keep the people safe. Roland, you'll command the defense. I trust you to hold off Mortar's forces for as long as possible." Sir Roland frowned, his brow furrowing. "You're going into the forest, aren't you? The Guardians. Alistair, are you sure about this? We don't even know if they'll help." "I have no other choice," Alistair replied, his eyes hard with determination. "I won't let this kingdom fall to Mortar. Not like this. If there's even a chance the Guardians can help, I have to try." Elora stepped forward, her hand resting gently on Alistair's arm. "Be careful, Alistair. The forest is not a place for men who seek power lightly. The Guardians do not forget the past easily." "I know," Alistair said softly, his gaze meeting hers. "But this is something I must do." With one last glance at the castle, the walls that had sheltered him for so many years, Alistair turned and began his journey toward the forest. The path ahead was dark, and the weight of the kingdom rested on his shoulders. The forest loomed before Sir Alistair like a living wall of shadows, its towering trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The sun had long since set, and the pale light of the moon barely pierced the thick canopy overhead. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, the air thick with the scent of moss and damp earth, while a heavy mist curled around the roots of the ancient trees. This was no ordinary forest. It was a place of old magic, steeped in legends that had long been whispered among the people of Drakenhold. The guardians of the forest were said to be its protectors, but they were not benevolent. Their power was ancient and wild, and they did not offer it freely. Sir Alistair had heard the stories growing up, tales of men who had ventured into the forest only to never return. Some said the guardians had killed them, others claimed that the forest itself had swallowed them whole. But Alistair had no choice. With the fate of Drakenhold hanging in the balance, he had to find the guardians and secure their help, no matter the cost. He knew the journey would be perilous, but he did not realize just how treacherous the forest would be until he stepped into its depths. The moment Alistair crossed the threshold of the forest, the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, and the oppressive silence pressed in on him from all sides. Every step he took seemed to echo unnaturally loud, the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot disturbing the eerie quiet. His senses were on high alert, every rustle of the wind through the trees causing his hand to tighten on the hilt of his sword. He had faced countless enemies in battle, but this felt different. The forest was alive, watching, waiting. As he ventured deeper, the path became less defined, the dense undergrowth making it nearly impossible to find his way. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, flickering shapes that disappeared as soon as he turned his head. The stories had warned of such things, phantoms that roamed the forest, spirits of those who had fallen prey to its enchantments. They whispered to him in voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, urging him to turn back, to leave before it was too late. But Alistair pressed on, his resolve unshaken. He was not a man easily swayed by fear, though the forest did its best to test him. Strange creatures skittered just beyond the reach of his torchlight, their eyes glowing eerily in the dark. At one point, he heard a low growl, a sound that reverberated through the trees and made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He turned, sword drawn, but saw nothing, only the endless sea of trees, their trunks twisting like the bones of ancient giants. The deeper he ventured, the more the forest seemed to close in around him. The path twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, and soon he realized he was being led not by his own sense of direction, but by the will of the forest itself. Time lost all meaning. The days and nights blended together in an endless twilight, and Alistair found himself struggling to remember how long he had been walking. His body ached from exhaustion, his mind fraying at the edges as the whispers of the forest grew louder, more insistent. Then came the trial, a test that Alistair had not expected, but one that he had been warned of in the old tales. As he reached a clearing, a cold wind swept through the trees, and a figure appeared before him. An ethereal, ghostly presence cloaked in mist. It was the warden, the spirit said to guard the entrance to the guardian's domain. Tall and imposing, with eyes that glowed like embers, the warden spoke without words, its voice echoing inside Alistair's mind. "Only those who are worthy may pass," the warden's voice boomed, filling Alistair's thoughts with a power that felt like thunder. "Your strength means nothing here. You seek the guardian's aid, but first, you must prove yourself. Face your greatest fear, and only then will the path be revealed." Alistair, already weary from the journey, stood firm, his hand gripping his sword tightly. But the warden did not attack. Instead, it gestured toward the ground before him. Alistair's heart pounded in his chest as he followed its gaze. And there, rising from the earth, was a figure from his past. His greatest fear made flesh. It was Cedric, his younger brother, who had fallen in battle many years ago, his death a weight that Alistair had carried ever since. Cedric had died because of a decision Alistair had made, a tactical error that had cost not only his brother's life but the lives of many under his command. Now, Cedric stood before him, his eyes hollow, his face pale as death. Alistair's breath caught in his throat, his chest tightening with grief and guilt. The figure of Cedric stared at him, accusing, a reminder of his greatest failure. The test was not of physical strength, but of courage. Courage to face the truth of his past, to confront the guilt that had haunted him for so long. Alistair knew that he could not run from this, that he had to face it if he hoped to gain the trust of the Guardians. But standing there, face to face with his brother's ghost, the pain was almost too much to bear. "I'm sorry," Alistair whispered, his voice cracking. "I failed you. I failed all of you." The figure of Cedric said nothing, but Alistair could feel the weight of his unspoken words. He had carried the burden of that failure for years, allowing it to eat away at him, to poison his heart. But here, in the heart of the forest, with the eyes of the warden upon him, he knew that he had to let it go. With great effort, Alistair knelt before the figure of his brother. "I will carry this guilt no longer. I will not let my past define me." At his words, the figure of Cedric began to fade, dissolving into the mist. The warden watched in silence, its gaze piercing but approving. Alistair had passed the test, not through strength of arms, but through the strength of his heart. Exhausted, both physically and emotionally, Alistair rose to his feet. The warden stepped aside, and the path ahead, once obscured by shadow, was now clear. The forest seemed to breathe around him, its hostility fading as if it recognized the change within him. The journey had been long and harrowing, but he had proven his worth. He had faced his greatest fear and emerged on the other side, not unscathed, but stronger for it. But the price had been steep. The encounter with his brother had reopened old wounds, and though Alistair had gained the Guardian's trust, the emotional toll would linger long after the battle was over. He had been forced to confront his past in a way he never had before, and while it had made him stronger, it had also left him vulnerable in ways he had never anticipated. With the warden's silent blessing, Alistair continued forward, deeper into the forest, toward the domain of the Guardians. The path was still uncertain, but now, at least, he knew he was not walking it alone. The forest had tested him, and he had emerged not just as a knight, but as a man ready to lead Drakenhold into whatever future awaited it. The morning sky over Drakenhold was heavy with storm clouds, their dark edges crackling with distant lightning as if the heavens themselves were preparing for the battle to come. The air was thick with tension and the smell of rain. From the walls of the castle, the soldiers of Drakenhold watched as Lord Mortar's army gathered once more at the edge of the valley. This time, however, there was no sense of uncertainty. This would be the final battle, the clash that would determine the fate of the kingdom. Inside the castle, the atmosphere was somber but resolute. Sir Roland, bruised and battle-worn, stood at the gate, readying the last of the men for what would likely be their final stand. Beside him, Lady Alora moved among the wounded, tending to them with a quiet grace that belied the fear in her heart. The people of Drakenhold had held the walls through sheer force of will, but they knew that without reinforcements, they would not survive another assault. And yet, even in the face of overwhelming odds, there was hope, because Sir Alistair had returned. From the moment he had crossed back into the kingdom's borders, Alistair could feel the weight of destiny upon him. He no longer traveled alone. The Guardians of the Forest, beings of ancient magic and power, moved silently beside him, their forms shifting between the shapes of men and creatures of the wild. Their eyes glowed faintly with a mystical light, and the forest itself seemed to move with them, its trees bending and bowing as if in reverence to their presence. Alistair had earned their trust, and now, they had come to honor the old alliance, to fight alongside the people of Drakenhold in their hour of need. As Alistair and the Guardians approached the gates of the castle, the soldiers on the walls could scarcely believe their eyes. The tales of the Guardians had long since faded into legend, but here they were, flesh and blood, or something beyond flesh and blood, moving with purpose and grace. Sir Roland met Alistair at the gate, his face a mixture of relief and disbelief. "You really did it," Roland said, his voice filled with awe as he eyed the Guardians. "I thought you'd never return." "I made a promise to this kingdom," Alistair replied, his voice steady, "and I intend to keep it." There was no time for further words. The drums of war began to beat once more, echoing across the valley as Lord Mortar's forces surged forward. Alistair took his place at the front lines, flanked by the Guardians, whose very presence seemed to radiate power. The soldiers of Drakenhold, weary though they were, stood taller now, emboldened by the sight of their leader returned and by the promise of the Guardians' aid. The battle began with a deafening roar as Mortar's army charged toward the castle, their banners flapping in the wind, their armor gleaming darkly beneath the storm-heavy sky. Alistair raised his sword, the steel catching the first flash of lightning, and with a cry, the soldiers of Drakenhold met the enemy head-on. But this time, they did not fight alone. The Guardians of the Forest unleashed their ancient magic upon the battlefield. Vines erupted from the ground, coiling around the legs of enemy soldiers and dragging them to the earth. Wolves, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light, leaped from the shadows of the trees, tearing through the ranks of Mortar's men with terrifying precision. The Guardians themselves moved like shadows, shifting between forms, sometimes appearing as men, other times as beasts, their movements fluid and deadly. Spears of wood and stone, summoned from the earth itself, impaled the enemy, while the sky above seemed to darken as the storm raged in response to their power. Lord Mortar's army, which had once seemed unstoppable, faltered in the face of this supernatural onslaught. The soldiers, though disciplined and battle-hardened, were not prepared for the sheer force of the Guardians' magic. Where once there had been confidence, now there was fear. Mortar's lieutenants barked orders, trying to rally their troops, but the momentum had shifted. Drakenhold's soldiers, inspired by the Guardians' power and Alistair's leadership, fought with renewed vigor. Their swords flashed in the storm-lit air, their shields holding strong against the enemy's advance. In the heart of the battle, Sir Alistair was a force of nature. His sword moved with precision and grace, cutting down enemies with a practiced ease that spoke of years spent on the battlefield. But it was more than just his skill with a blade that gave him strength. The Guardians had imbued him with their power, and as he fought, the very earth seemed to rise up to aid him. Roots and vines tangled around his enemies' feet, slowing their movements just enough for Alistair to strike with deadly accuracy. He moved like the storm itself, relentless and unstoppable. As the battle raged on, Alistair finally came face to face with Lord Mortar. The warlord was as imposing as the legends had claimed, tall and broad, clad in dark armor that seemed to absorb the very light around him. His sword was a massive, brutal thing, designed to crush rather than cut, and his eyes burned with a fierce, unyielding hatred. "You think this changes anything?" Mortar snarled, his voice a low growl as he swung his blade toward Alistair. "I will burn this kingdom to the ground. Guardians or no Guardians." Alistair parried the blow, the force of it reverberating up his arm, but he held his ground. "This kingdom will not fall to you," he said, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "Not while I still stand." The two clashed in a violent exchange, their swords ringing out over the battlefield as the storm raged above. Mortar was strong, far stronger than any opponent Alistair had ever faced, but Alistair had the advantage of both skill and the magic of the Guardians. As they fought, Alistair could feel the power of the forest flowing through him, giving him strength beyond his own. In a final, desperate move, Mortar swung his great sword in a wide arc, aiming to break through Alistair's defenses. But Alistair was ready. He sidestepped the blow and, with a swift, fluid motion, drove his sword into the gap in Mortar's armor. The warlord's eyes widened in shock as the blade pierced his chest, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a low, guttural sound, Mortar crumpled to the ground, the life draining from his body. With the fall of Lord Mortar, the battle quickly turned in Drakenhold's favor. His army, leaderless and demoralized, began to retreat, their once organized ranks dissolving into chaos. The Guardians pressed the attack, their magic relentless, until the remaining forces fled the battlefield in disarray. As the last of Mortar's soldiers disappeared into the distance, a great cheer rose up from the soldiers of Drakenhold. The battle was over. The kingdom had been saved. Sir Alistair stood in the center of the battlefield, breathing heavily, his sword still gripped tightly in his hand. The storm above finally began to dissipate, the clouds parting to reveal a pale sliver of sunlight breaking through. Around him, the Guardians of the Forest stood silently, their forms shifting once more into the shadows, their task complete. Drakenhold had endured, not just through strength of arms, but through the unity of its people and the ancient magic of the land. The price had been high, but the kingdom was still standing, and for the first time in a long while, there was hope. Alistair looked out over the battlefield, the weight of everything that had happened settling heavily on his shoulders. He had won the battle, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain. He had faced his greatest fears, forged an alliance with ancient powers, and saved his kingdom. But now, as the dust settled and the dead were honored, he knew that the true work was just beginning. Drakenhold had been spared, but the wounds of the past still ran deep, and the kingdom would need more than victory to heal. It would need wisdom, unity, and justice, qualities that Alistair would now fight to preserve in the days to come. As the echoes of battle faded and the battlefield grew quiet, Sir Alistair stood atop the walls of Drakenhold, gazing out over the kingdom he had fought so hard to save. The victory against Lord Mortar had been hard won, but the warlord's defeat had brought only a fleeting sense of triumph. The true battle, Alistair realized, was not with Mortar's army, but with the kingdom itself, a kingdom teetering on the edge of corruption, its foundations rotting from within. The streets of Drakenhold, once bustling with life, now bore the scars of war. The people cheered Alistair's name, hailing him as a hero, but their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollowed by years of suffering under the yoke of a corrupt nobility. The kingdom's nobles, those who had squabbled over power while the kingdom crumbled around them, were already beginning to reassert their authority, gathering in secret meetings, whispering plans to restore the old order. They had stayed safe behind the walls while others bled on the battlefield. And now, in the aftermath of the war, they sought to regain control, to reap the benefits of a victory they had done nothing to secure. Alistair knew the truth. The real enemy had always been inside the walls of Drakenhold. Mortar's invasion had been a threat, but the nobles' greed, their self-serving politics, and their disregard for the people were the true poison eating away at the kingdom. The battle may have been won, but the war for Drakenhold's soul had just begun. Standing at his side, Lady Alora sensed the turmoil within him. Her soft voice broke the silence, her words laced with both understanding and concern. The people look to you now, Alistair. They see you as their savior. But what will you do next? Alistair's gaze hardened as he looked down at the courtyard below, where the nobles had already begun to gather, their fine robes stark against the backdrop of the wounded soldiers and the smoke still rising from the battlefield. Those who claim to rule this kingdom have done nothing but tear it apart, he said quietly, his voice edged with bitterness. They let the kingdom fall into ruin, and now they seek to take control again, as if nothing has changed. Elora studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face. You have the power now, Alistair. With the Guardians at your side, you could change everything. The people would follow you. You could bring down the corrupt nobility, restore justice to the kingdom, and rebuild Drakenhold as it was meant to be. Alistair knew she was right. The Guardians of the Forest had pledged their allegiance to him, their ancient magic at his command. With their power, he could easily sweep aside the nobles who had caused so much suffering, seize control of the kingdom, and create a new order, one based on justice, fairness, and the well-being of the people. He could break the cycle of greed and corruption that had plagued Drakenhold for generations. The Guardians had given him the means to reshape the kingdom, to be the leader Drakenhold needed, not the puppet of a decaying aristocracy. And yet, as the weight of that power pressed down on him, a deep unease began to stir in Alistair's heart. The Guardians were ancient and wise, but they were not bound by the same moral codes as men. Their power was wild, untamed, and dangerous. They had come to his aid because he had proven himself worthy, but their loyalty was to the land itself, not to the whims of kings or men. Alistair had seen firsthand the devastation they could unleash on the battlefield, and while their magic had saved Drakenhold from Mortar's army, it had also left a scar on the land, a reminder of the cost of such power. If he used the Guardians to overthrow the nobility, to take control of the kingdom by force, what kind of leader would he become? Would he be any different from the tyrants he sought to overthrow? The thought gnawed at him, the fear that in using such power, he might become the very thing he despised. Drakenhold needed justice, but it also needed peace. The people were weary, battered by war and suffering. Could he truly ask them to endure another conflict, even one fought in the name of justice? Sir Roland, his closest friend and comrade, joined them at the wall, his brow furrowed with concern. The nobles are already making their moves, he said, his voice gruff. They think the victory is theirs. They're talking about restoring the old council, putting the same corrupt lords back in power. You can't let them do this, Alistair. Not after everything we've fought for. Alistair's jaw tightened. And if I do nothing, if I allow them to take control again, the cycle will continue. The people will suffer, just as they always have. Roland's gaze was fierce. Then break the cycle. Use the power you have. The Guardians are with you. Take the throne if you must, but don't let those vultures pick the kingdom clean. Lady Alora placed a hand on Alistair's arm, her voice gentle but firm. Power like this changes men, Alistair. You have to ask yourself, what kind of king would you become? Would you rule with justice, or would the temptation of absolute power corrupt you, as it has so many before? And there it was, the heart of the dilemma that had haunted Alistair since the moment the battle ended. He had always been a man of honor, bound by a code that placed the well-being of others above his own. But now, with the power of the Guardians at his fingertips, the line between justice and tyranny blurred. Could he truly trust himself to wield such power without becoming like the very men he sought to defeat? The storm clouds above rumbled ominously, as if echoing the turmoil within him. Alistair looked out over the kingdom he had sworn to protect, the kingdom he loved. He could see the faces of the people, hopeful, fearful, uncertain. They looked to him for guidance, for leadership. But what would he choose? If he allowed the corrupt nobility to regain control, Drakenhold would fall back into the same patterns of greed and exploitation. The kingdom might survive for a time, but it would not thrive. The people would continue to suffer, and the dream of a just and fair kingdom would die before it had even begun. But if he used the Guardians to seize power, to tear down the old order and rebuild the kingdom in his image, he risked becoming something worse. Another tyrant, another ruler who believed he alone knew what was best for the people. The weight of the choice was almost unbearable. In the end, it was not the Guardians' power that would save Drakenhold. It was not magic or strength of arms that would determine the kingdom's future. It was the people, their will, their resilience, their hope for something better. Alistair knew that true change could not be forced from above. It had to come from within, from the hearts of those who called Drakenhold home. With a heavy sigh, Alistair turned to Elora and Roland, his decision clear. "I will not become what I despise," he said quietly. "The Guardians gave me their trust, but I will not use their power to rule through fear. We will rebuild this kingdom, but we will do it together, with the people. The nobles will face justice, but it will be the justice of the people, not my own." Roland looked at him, his expression conflicted but respectful. "And if the nobles resist? Then we will show them that Drakenhold belongs to the people, not to those who seek to control it for their own gain," Alistair said, his voice firm. "But I will not become a tyrant, Roland. We will fight for justice, not for power." Elora smiled softly, her eyes filled with pride. "You've made the right choice, Alistair. The kingdom needs a leader, not a conqueror." And with that, the path forward became clear. The battle for Drakenhold's soul was far from over, but it would not be won through force or fear. It would be won through unity, through the strength of the people and the pursuit of true justice. Alistair had faced his greatest temptation and had emerged not as a ruler, but as a guardian of the kingdom's future, one who would fight not for power, but for the promise of a better tomorrow.